Good morning. This is Number the Stars. I'm going to start on chapter 7 and I'm going to read um, to chapter 11. So we're going to do 7, 8, 9, and 10. And I'm starting on page 60. So this is called The House by the Sea. Oh, Anne Marie, Ellen said with awe in her voice. It's beautiful. Anne Marie looked around and nodded her head in agreement. The house and the meadows that surrounded it were so much a part of her childhood, part of her life, that she didn't often look at them with fresh eyes. But now she did, seeing Ellen's pleasure, and it was true. They were beautiful. The little red roof farmhouse was very old, its chimney crooked, and even the small shuttered windows tilted at angles. The birds A bird's nest, wispy with straw, was half hidden in the corner where the roof met the wall above a bedroom window. Nearby, a gnarled tree was still speckled with a few apples now long past ripe. Mamma and Kirsty had gone inside, but Anne Marie and Ellen ran across the high grass meadow through the late wildflowers. From nowhere, a gray kitten appeared and ran beside them, pouncing here and there upon imagined mice, pausing to lick its paws and then darting off again. It pretended to ignore the girls, but looked back often to be certain that they were still there, apparently pleased to have playmates. The meadow ended at the sea. The gray water licked there at the damp brown grass flattened by the wind and bordered by smooth, heavy stones. I've never been this close to the sea, Ellen said. Of course you have. You've been to the harbor in Copenhagen 1,000,000 times. Ellen laughed. I mean the real sea, the way it is here, open like this, a whole world of water. Anne Marie shook her head in amazement. To live in Denmark, a country surrounded by water, and never to have stood at its edge? Your parents are really city people, aren't they? Ellen nodded. My mother is afraid of the ocean, she said, laughing. She says it's too big for her and too cold. The girls sat on a rock and took off their shoes and socks. They tiptoed across the damp stones and let the water touch their feet. It was cold. They giggled and stepped back. Anne Marie leaned down and picked up a brown leaf that floated back and forth with the movement of the water. Look, she said, this leaf may have come from a tree in Sweden. It could have blown from a tree into the sea and floated all the way across. See over there, she said, pointing. See the land way across there? That's Sweden. Ellen cupped one hand over her eyes and looked across the water at the misty shoreline that was another country. It's not so very far, she said. Maybe, Anne Marie suggested, standing over there are two girls just our age looking across and saying, That's Denmark. They squinted into the hazy distance as if they might see Swedish children standing there and looking back, but it was too far. They only saw a hazy strip of land and two small boats bobbing up and down in the gray ruffles of separating water. I wonder if one of those is your Uncle Henrik's boat, Ellen said. Maybe. I can't tell. They're too far away. Uncle Henrik's boat is named the Ingeborg, he told Ellen, for Mama. Ellen looked around. Does he keep it right here? Does he tie it up so that it won't float away? Anne Marie laughed. Oh, no. In town at the harbor, there's a big dock, and all the fishing boats go and come from there. That's where they unload their fish. You should smell it. At night, they are all there, anchored in the harbor. Anne Marie, Ellen. Mama's voice came across the meadow, and the girls looked around and saw her waving to them. They turned, picked up their shoes, and began walking toward the house. The kitten, who had settled comfortably on a stony shore, rose immediately and followed them. I took Ellen down to show her the sea, Anne Marie explained when they reached the place where Mama waited. She'd never been that close before. We started to wade, but it was too cold. I wish we'd come in summer so we could swim. It's cold even then, Mama said. She looked around. You didn't see anyone, did you? You didn't talk to anyone. Anne Marie shook her head. Just the kitten. Ellen had picked it up and it lay purring in her arms as she stroked its small head and talked to it softly. I meant to warn you. You must stay away from people while we are here. But there's no one around here, Anne Marie reminded her. Even so, if you see anyone at all, even someone you know, one of Henrik's friends, it is better if you come in the house. It is too difficult, maybe even dangerous, to explain who Ellen is. Ellen looked up and bit her lip. There aren't soldiers here, too, she asked. Mama sighed. I'm afraid there are soldiers everywhere, and especially now. This is a bad time. Come in now and help me fix supper. Henrik will be home. Watch the step there, it's loose. Do you know what I have done? I found enough apples for applesauce, and even though there is no sugar, the apples are sweet. Enric will bring home some fish, and there will be wood for the fire, so tonight we will be warm and well fed. It's not a bad time then, Anne-Marie told her, not if there's applesauce. Ellen kissed the kitten's head and let it leap from her arms to the ground. It darted away and disappeared in the tall grass. They followed Mama into the house. That night, the girls dressed for bed in the small upstairs bedroom they were sharing, the same bedroom that had been Mama's when she was a little girl. Across the hall, Kirsten was already asleep in the wide bed that once belonged to Anne-Marie's grandparents. Ellen touched her neck after she had put on Anne-Marie's flower-sprigged nightgown, which Mama had packed. "Where's my necklace?" she asked. "What did you do with it?" "I hid it in a safe place," Anne-Marie told her, "a very secret place where no one will ever find it, and I will keep it there for you until it is safe for you to wear it again." Ellen nodded. "Papa gave it to me when I was very small," she explained. She sat down on the edge of the old bed and ran her fingers along the handmade quilt that covered it. The flowers and birds, faded now, had been stitched into the quilt by Anne-Marie's great-grandmother many years before. "I wish I knew where my parents are," Ellen said in a small voice as she outlined one of the appliqué birds with her finger. Anne-Marie didn't have an answer for her. She patted Ellen's hand and they sat together silently. Through the window, they could see a thin, round slice of moon appear through the clouds against the pale sky. The Scandinavian night was not very dark yet, though soon, when winter came, the night would be not only dark, but very long, night skies beginning in the late afternoon and lasting until morning. From downstairs, they could hear Mama's voice and Uncle Enric's talking, catching up on the news. Mama missed her brother when she hadn't seen him for a while, and Anne-Marie knew. They were very close. Mama always teased him gently for not marrying. She asked him, laughing, when they were together, whether he had found a good wife yet one that would keep his house tidier. Henrik teased back and told Mama that she should come to Gillahee to live again so that he wouldn't have to do all the chores by himself. For a moment, to Anne-Marie, listening, it seemed like all the earlier times, the happy visits to the farm in the past with summer daylight extending beyond bedtime, and the children tucked away in the bedrooms and the grown-ups downstairs talking. But there was a difference. In earlier times, she had always overheard laughter. Tonight, there was no laughter at all. This is chapter 8, titled, "There Has Been a Death." Through a haze of dreams, Anne-Marie heard Enric rise and leave the house, headed for the barn with his milking pail at daybreak. Later, when she woke again, it was morning. She could hear birds calling outside, one of them close by the window in the apple tree, and she could hear Mama below in the kitchen talking to Kirsty. Ellen was still asleep. The night before, so shortened by the soldiers in the Copenhagen apartment, seemed long ago. Anne-Marie rose quietly so that she wouldn't wake her friend. She pulled on her clothes and went down the narrow curved staircase to find her sister kneeling on the kitchen floor trying to make the gray kitten drink water from a bowl. "Silly," she said. "Kittens like milk, not water." "I'm teaching this one new habits," Kirsty explained importantly, "and I have named him Thor, for the god of thunder." Anne-Marie burst out laughing. She looked at the tiny kitten who was shaking his head, irritated at his wet whiskers, as Kirsty kept trying to dip his face into the water. "God of thunder," Anne-Marie said. "He looks as if he would run and hide if there were a thunderstorm." "He has a mother someplace who would comfort him, I imagine," Mama said. "And when he wants milk, he'll find his mama. Or he could go visit the cow," Kirsty said. Although Henrik no longer raised crops on the farm, as his parents had, he still kept a cow who munched happily on the meadow grass and gave a little milk each day in return. Now and then he was able to send cheese to Copenhagen to his sister's family. This morning, Anne-Marie noticed with delight Mama had made oatmeal and that there was a pitcher of cream on the table. It was a very long time since she had tasted cream. At home, they had bread and tea every morning. Mama followed Anne-Marie's eyes to the pitcher. "Fresh from Blossom," she said. "Enric milks her every morning before he leaves for the boat. And," she added, "there's butter too. Usually not even Enric has butter, but he managed to save a little this time." "Save a little from what?" Anne-Marie asked, spooning oatmeal into a floured bowl. "Don't tell me the soldiers tried to, what's the word? Relocate butter too." She laughed at her own joke, but it wasn't a joke at all, though Mama laughed ruefully. "They do," she said. "They relocate all the farmers' butter right into the stomach of their army. I suppose if they knew Henrik kept this tiny bit, they would come with guns and march it away down the path." Kirsty joined in their laughter as the three of them pictured a mound of frightened butter under military arrest. The kitten darted away when Kirsty's attention was distracted and settled on the windowsill. And suddenly, here in this sunlit kitchen, with cream in a pitcher and a bird in the apple tree beside the door, and out in the catgut where Uncle Henrik, surrounded by bright blue sky and water, pulled in his nets filled with shiny silver fish. Suddenly, the specter of guns and grim-faced soldiers seemed nothing more than a ghost story, a joke which to frighten the children in the dark. Ellen appeared in the kitchen doorway, smiling sleepily, and Mama put another floured bowl of steaming oatmeal on the wooden table. Cream, Anne-Marie said, gesturing to the pitcher with a grin. All day long, the girls played out of doors under the brilliant, clear sky and sun. Anne-Marie took Ellen to the small pasture beyond the barn and introduced her to Blossom, who gave a lazy, rough-textured lick to the palm of Ellen's hand when she extended it timidly. The kitten scampered about and chased flying insects across the meadow. The girls picked armfuls of wildflowers, dried brown, now by the early fall chill, and arranged them in pots and pitchers until the tabletops were crowded with their bouquets. Inside the house, Mama scrubbed and dusted, tisking at Uncle Henrik's untidy housekeeping. She took the rugs out to the clothesline and beat them with a stick, scattering dust into the air. He needs a wife, she said, shaking her head, and attacked the old wooden floors with a broom while the rugs aired. Just look at this, she said, opening the door to the little-used formal living room with its old-fashioned furniture. He never dusts. And she picked up her cleaning rags. And Kirsty, she added, the god of thunder made a very small rain shower in the corner of the kitchen floor. Please keep an eye on him. Late in the afternoon, Uncle Henrik came home. He grinned when he saw the newly cleaned and polished house and the double doors to the living room wide open, the rugs aired, and the windows washed. Henrik, you need a wife, Mama scolded him. Uncle Henrik laughed and joined Mama on the steps near the kitchen door. Why do I need a wife when I have a sister? He asked in his booming voice. Mama sighed, but her eyes were twinkling. And you need to stay home more often to take care of the house. This step is broken, and there's a leaking faucet in the kitchen, and Henrik was grinning at her, shaking his head in mock dismay. And there are mice in the attic, and my brown sweater has a big moth hole in the sleeve, and if I don't wash the windows soon, they laughed together. Anyway, Mama said, I have opened every window, Henrik, to let the air in and the sunlight. Thank goodness it's such a beautiful day. Tomorrow will be a day for fishing, Henrik said, his smile disappearing. Anne-Marie, listening, recognized the odd phrase. Papa had said something like it on the telephone. Is the weather good for fishing, Henrik? Papa had asked. Well, what did it mean? Henrik went fishing every day, rain or shine. Denmark's fishermen didn't wait for sunny days to take their boats out and throw their nets into the sea. Anne-Marie, silent, sitting with Ellen under the apple tree, watched her uncle. Mama looked at him. The weather is right, she asked. Henrik nodded and looked at the sky. He smelled the air. I will be going back to the boat tonight after supper. We will leave very early in the morning. I will stay on the boat all night. Anne-Marie wondered what it would be like to be on a boat all night, to lie at anchor, hearing the sea slap against the sides, to see the stars from your place on the sea. Have you prepared the living room? Uncle Henrik asked suddenly. Mama nodded. It is clean, and I moved the furniture a bit to make room. And you saw the flowers, she added. I hadn't thought of it, but the girls picked dried flowers from the meadow. Prepared a living room for what? Anne-Marie asked. Why did you move the furniture? Mama looked at Uncle Henrik. He had reached down for the kitten scampering past and now held it against his chest and scratched its chin gently. It arched its small back with pleasure. Well, girls, he said, it is a sad event, but not too sad, really, because she was very, very old. There has been a death, and tonight your great Aunt Bertie will be resting in the living room in her casket before she's buried tomorrow. It is the old custom, you know, for the dead to rest at home and their loved ones to be with them before the burial. Kirsty was listening with a fascinated look. Right here, she asked, a dead person right here? Anne-Marie said nothing. She was confused. This was the first she had heard of a death in the family. No one had called Copenhagen to say that there had been a death, and no one seemed sad. And most puzzling of all, she had never heard of Great Aunt Bertie. Surely she would have known if she had a relative by that name. Kirsty might not. Kirsty was little and didn't pay attention to such things, but Anne-Marie did. She had always been fascinated by her mother's stories and of her own childhood, and she remembered the names of all the cousins, the great aunts and uncles who had been a tease, who had been a grouch, and who had been such a scold that her husband had finally moved away to a different house, though they continued to have dinner together every night. Such a wonderful, interesting stories filled with colorful personalities of her mother's family. And Anne Marie was quite sure, quite certain, though she said nothing, there was no great Aunt Bertie. She didn't exist. This is chapter 9 called Why Are You Lying? Anne Marie went outside alone after supper. Through the kitchen window, she could hear Mama and Ellen talking as they washed the dishes. Kirsty, she knew, was busy on the floor playing with old dolls she had found upstairs, the dolls that had been Mama's once long ago. The kitten had fled when she tried to dress it and disappeared. She wandered to the barn where Uncle Henrik was milking Blossom. He was kneeling on the straw-covered floor beside the cow, his shoulder pressed against her heavy side, and his strong tan hands rhythmically urging her milk into the spotless bucket. The god of thunder sat alertly poised nearby watching. Blossom looked up at Anne Marie with big brown eyes and moved her wrinkled mouth like an old woman adjusting false teeth. Anne Marie leaned against the ancient splintery wood of the barn wall and listened to the sharp rattling sound of the streams of milk as they hit the sides of the bucket. Uncle Enric glanced over at her and smiled without pausing in the rhythm of milking. He didn't say anything. Through the barn windows, the pinkish light of sunset fell in irregular shapes upon the stacked hay. Flecks of dust and straw floated there in the light. Uncle Henrik, Anne Marie said suddenly, her voice cold, you are lying to me. You and Mama both. His strong hands continued, deftly pressing like a pulse against the cow. The steady streams of milk still came, and he looked at her again, his deep blue eyes kind and questioning. You are angry, he said. Yes, Mama has never lied to me before, never. But I know there's no great Aunt Bertie. Never once in all the stories I've heard and all the pictures I've seen has there been a great Aunt Bertie. Uncle Enric sighed. Blossom looked back at him as if to say, almost done? And indeed the streams of milk lessened and slowed. He tugged at the cow gently but firmly, pulling down the last bit of milk. The bucket was half full, frothy on the top, and finally he set it aside and washed the cow's udder with a clean, damp cloth. And then he lifted the bucket to a shelf and covered it. He rubbed the cow's neck affectionately, and at last he turned to Anne Marie as he wiped his own hands in the cloth. How brave are you, little Anne Marie? He asked suddenly. She was startled and dismayed. It was a question she did not want to be asked. When she asked it of herself, she did not like her own answer. Not very, she confessed, looking at the floor of the barn. Tall Uncle Enric knelt before her so that his face was level with hers. Behind him, Blossom lowered her head and grasped a mouthful of hay in her mouth and drew it in with her tongue. The kitten cocked his head, waiting, still hoping for spilled milk. I think that is not true, Uncle Henrik said. I think you are like your mama and like your papa and like me. Frightened, but determined. And if the time came to be brave, I am quite sure you would be very, very brave. But, he added, it is much easier to be brave if you do not know everything. And so your mama does not know everything. Neither do I. We only know what we need to know. Do you understand what I'm saying? He asked, looking into her eyes. Anne Marie frowned. She wasn't sure. What did bravery mean? She had been frightened the day, not long ago, though now it seemed far in the past, when the soldier had stopped her on the street and asked questions in his rough voice. And she had not known everything then. She had not known that the Germans were going to take away the Jews. And so, when the soldier asked, looking at Ellen that day, what is your friend's name? She had been able to answer him even though she was frightened. If she had known everything, it would not have been so easy to be brave. She began to understand just a little. Yes, she said to Uncle Henrik, I think I understand. You guessed correctly, he told her. There is no great Aunt Bertie, and there never has been. Your mama lied to you, and so do I. We did so, he explained, to help you to be brave, because we love you. Will you forgive us for that? Anne Marie nodded. She felt older suddenly. And I'm not going to tell you any more, not now, for the same reason. Do you understand? Anne Marie nodded again. Suddenly there was a noise outside, and Uncle Enric's shoulders stiffened. He rose quickly and went to the window of the barn, stood in the shadows and looked out, and then he turned back to Anne Marie. It is the hearse, he said. It is great Aunt Bertie, who never was. He smiled wryly. So, my little friend, it is time for the night of mourning to begin. Are you ready? Anne Marie took her uncle's hand, and he led her from the barn. The gleaming wooden casket rested on supports in the center of the living room and was surrounded by the fragile, papery flowers that Anne Marie and Ellen had picked that afternoon. Lighted candles stood in the holders on the table and cast a soft, flickering light. The hearse had gone, and the solemn-faced men who had carried the casket indoors had gone with it after speaking quietly to Uncle Henrik. Kirsty had gone to bed reluctantly, complaining that she wanted to stay up with the others and that she was grown up enough and that she had never before seen a dead person in a closed-up box, that it wasn't fair. But Mama had been firm, and finally Kirsty, sulking, had trudged upstairs with her dolls under one arm and a kitten under the other. Ellen was silent and had a sad expression. "I'm so sorry your Aunt Bertie died," Anne-Marie heard her say to Mama, who smiled sadly and thanked her. Anne-Marie had listened and said nothing. So now I too am lying, she thought, and to my very best friend. I could tell Ellen that it isn't true and that there is no great Aunt Bertie. I could take her aside and whisper the secret to her so that she wouldn't have to feel sad, but she didn't. She understood that she was protecting Ellen the way Mother had protected her, although she didn't understand what was happening or why the casket was there or who in truth was in it. She knew that it was better, safer for Ellen to believe in great Aunt Bertie, so she said nothing. Other people came as the night sky drew darker. A man and woman, both of them dressed in dark clothing. The woman carrying a sleeping baby appeared at the door, and Uncle Henrik gestured them inside. They nodded to Mama and to the girls, and they went, following Uncle Henrik, to the living room and sat down quietly. "Friends of great Aunt Bertie," Mama said quietly in response to Anne-Marie's questioning look. Anne-Marie knew that Mama was lying again, and she could see that Mama understood that she knew. They looked at each other for a long time and said nothing. In that moment, with that look, they became equals. From the living room came the sound of a sleepy baby's brief wail. Anne-Marie glanced through the door and saw the woman open her blouse and begin to nurse the infant, who quieted. Another man arrived, an old man, bearded. Quietly, he went to the living room and sat down, saying nothing to the others, who only glanced at him. The young woman lifted her baby's blanket, covering its face with her own breast, and the man bent his head forward and closed his eyes as if he were praying. Excuse me. His mouth moved silently, forming words that no one could hear. Anne-Marie stood in the doorway, watching the mourners as they sat in the candlelit room, and then she turned back to the kitchen and began to help Ellen and Mama as they prepared food. In Copenhagen, she remembered when Lisa died, friends had come to their apartment every evening. All of them had brought food so that Mama wouldn't need to cook. Why hadn't these people brought food? Why didn't they talk? In Copenhagen, even though the talk was sad, people had spoken softly to one another and to Mama and Papa. They had talked about Lisa and remembering happier times. Thinking about it, she sliced cheese in the kitchen. Anne-Marie realized that these people had nothing to talk about. They couldn't speak of happier times with great Aunt Bertie when there had never been a great Aunt Bertie at all. Uncle Henrik came into the kitchen and he glanced at his watch and then at Mama. "It's getting late," he said. "I should go to the boat." He looked worried and he blew out the candle so that there would be no light at all, and he opened the door. He stared beyond the gnarled apple tree into the darkness. "Good, here they come," he said in a low, relieved voice. "Ellen, come with me." Ellen looked questioningly towards Mama and nodded. "Go with Henrik," she said. Anne-Marie watched, still holding the wedge of firm cheese in her hand, as Ellen followed Uncle Henrik into the yard. She could hear a sharp, low cry from Ellen, and then the sound of voices speaking softly. And in a moment, Uncle Henrik returned, and behind him was Peter Nielsen. Tonight, Peter went first to Mama and hugged her, and then hugged Anne-Marie and kissed her on the cheek. But he said nothing. There was no playfulness to his affection tonight, just a sense of urgency, of worry. He went immediately to the living room, looked around, and nodded at the silent people there. Ellen was still outside, but in a moment the door opened and she returned, held tightly like a little girl, her bare legs dangling against her father's chest, and her mother was beside them. Excuse me just a minute. This chapter is called "Let's Open the Casket." "You are all here now," Uncle Henrik said, looking around the room. "I must go." Anne-Marie stood in the wide doorway looking from the hall. The baby slept now, and its mother looked tired. Her husband sat beside her, his arm across her shoulders. The old man's head was still bent. Peter sat alone, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees. It was clear that he was deep in thought. On the sofa, Ellen sat between her parents, one hand clasped tightly in her mother's. She looked up at Anne-Marie but didn't smile. Anne-Marie felt a surge of sadness. The bond of their friendship had not broken, but it was as if Ellen had moved now into a different world, a world of her own family and whatever lay ahead for them. The elderly bearded man looked up suddenly as Uncle Henrik prepared to go. God keep you safe, he said in a firm but quiet voice. Henrik nodded. God keep us all safe, he replied. And then he returned and left the room. A moment later, Anne Marie heard him leave the house. Mama brought the teapot from the kitchen and a tray of cups. Anne Marie helped her pass the cups around. No one spoke. Anne Marie, Mama whispered to her in the hall, you may go to bed if you want to. It is very late. Anne Marie shook her head, but she was tired. She could see that Ellen was too. Her friend's head was leaning on her mother's shoulder, and her eyes closed now and then. Finally, Anne Marie went to the empty rocking chair in the corner of the living room and curled there with her head against its soft padded back. She dozed. She was startled from her half sleep by the sudden sweep of headlights through the sheer curtain, and across the room a car pulled up outside. The car doors slammed, and everyone in the room tensed, and no one spoke. She heard, as if in a recurring nightmare, the pounding on the door, and then the heavy, frighteningly familiar staccato of boots on the kitchen floor. The woman with the baby gasped and began suddenly to weep. The male, accented voice from the kitchen was loud. We have observed, he said, that an unusual number of people have gathered at this house tonight. What is the explanation? There has been a death, Mama's voice replied calmly. It is always our custom to gather and pay our respects when a family member dies. I am sure you are familiar with our customs. One of the officers pushed Mama ahead of him from the kitchen and entered the living room. There were others behind him. They filled the wide doorway. As always, their boots gleamed, their guns, their helmets, all of them gleamed in the candlelight. Anne Marie watched as the man's eyes moved around the room. He looked for a long time at the casket, and then he removed his gaze, focusing on each person in turn. When his eyes reached her, she looked back at him steadily. Who died? He asked harshly. No one answered. They watched Anne Marie, and she realized that the officer was directing the question at her. Now she knew for certain what Uncle Henrik had meant when he had talked to her in the barn. To be brave came more easily if you knew nothing. She swallowed. My great Aunt Bertie, she lied in a firm voice. The officer moved forward suddenly across the room to the casket. He placed one gloved hand on the lid. Poor great Aunt Bertie, he said in a condescending voice. I do know your customs, he said, turning his gaze toward Mama, who still stood in the doorway. And I know that it is the custom to pay one's respect by looking your loved one in the face. It seems odd to me that you have closed the coffin up so tightly. His hand in a fist, he rubbed it across the edge of the polished lid. Why is it not open? He demanded. Let us open it up and take one last look at great Aunt Bertie. Anne Marie saw Peter across the room stiffen in his chair, lift his chin, and reach slowly with one hand toward his side. Mama walked quickly across the room, directly to the casket, directly to the officer. You're right, she said. The doctor said it should be closed because Aunt Bertie died of typhus, and he said there was still a chance the germs would still be there and would still be dangerous. But what does he know? Only a country doctor and an old man at that. Surely typhus germs wouldn't linger on a dead person. And dear Aunt Bertie, I've been so longing to see her face, to kiss her goodbye. Of course we will open the casket. I'm glad you suggested. With a swift motion, the Nazi officer slapped Mama across her face. She staggered backward, and a white mark on her cheek darkened. You foolish woman, he spat, to think that we have any interest in seeing the body of your diseased aunt. Open it after we leave, he said. With one gloved thumb, he pressed the candle flame into darkness. The hot wax spattered the table. Put all these candles out, he said, or pull the curtains. Then he strode to the doorway and left the room. Motionless, silent, one hand to her cheek, Mama listened. They all listened as the uniformed men left the house. In a moment, they heard the car doors, the sound of its engine, and finally they heard it drive away. Mama, Anne Marie cried. Her mother shook her head quickly and glanced at the open window covered only by the sheer curtain. Anne Marie understood. There might still be soldiers outside watching and listening. Peter stood and drew the dark curtains across the windows. He relit the extinguished candle, and then he reached for the old Bible that had always been there on the mantel. He opened it quickly and said, I will read a psalm. His eyes turned to the page he had opened at random, and he began to read in a strong voice. Oh, praise the Lord. How good it is to sing songs to our God. How pleasant to praise him. The Lord is rebuilding Jerusalem. He gathers in the scattered sons of Israel. It is he who heals the broken in spirit and binds up their wounds. He who numbers the stars one by one. Mama sat down and listened, and gradually they each began to relax. Anne Marie could see the old man across the room moving his lips as Peter read. He knew the ancient psalm by heart. Anne-Marie didn't. The words were unfamiliar to her, and she tried to listen, tried to understand, and tried to forget the war and the Nazis, and tried not to cry, tried to be brave. The night breeze moved the dark curtains at the open windows, and outside she knew the sky was speckled with stars. How could anyone number them one by one, as the psalm said? There were too many. The sky was too big. Ellen had said that her mother was frightened of the ocean and that it was too cold and too big. The sky was too, thought Anne-Marie. The whole world was too cold, too big, and too cruel. Peter read on in his firm voice, though it was clear he was tired. The long minutes passed. They seemed hours. Finally, still reading, he moved quietly to the window. He closed the Bible and listened to the quiet night. Then he looked around the room. Now, he said, it is time. First, he closed the windows, and then he went to the casket and opened the lid. And we will stop there for today. And I will start reading with chapter 11 tomorrow. I hope you have a great day, and I'll be back tomorrow.